less in the last, there was a little bit of an economic crisis in 1908. So Congress was less likely to go along. But for all of these, you're arguing, maybe the last one's a little bit different with world affairs, that the U.S. government took a far more active role, and you just have to have examples for each. And it's not a long essay. Like this one might be a little bit shorter because there's not a whole lot to talk about. I can think that maybe even one or two examples on each one would help explain the answer. So what could you say for Roosevelt and labor? Good, and that is to me is the example you should use. Who was it this morning? They were sitting here. Karen?
The meat inspection.
That's funny. I said, who was that sitting over here? And Gerald said the meat inspection act. It was Karen. She's a little different than the meat inspection act. Yes, but we'll put that one in here. She asked, I was trying to describe how I was going to grade them. That's when I realized I needed a rubric. She said, are there certain things you're looking for? And I said, no. Like because we made the list of the Plains Indian one, and I could tell everybody was like, that's too much for me to write. And I said, if you had about 80% of this, that would be an A. That's really good. But yeah, there are some things that you shouldn't miss. And for this one, the examples that we're using, like if you didn't talk about the anthracite coal strike, that would be a big omission. I don't know how you talk about him and labor without talking about that. If you didn't specifically talk about his concept of the square deal, well, I'd be okay with that. But definitely the anthracite coal strike. And this was a multiple choice item on your last quiz. What was significant about that? You don't have to raise your hand, it's after school, it's okay.
He didn't immediately side with the owners.
Right, and then for this you should talk about what happened before where they immediately sided with business to the point of using the U.S. Army to bust workers' heads. In this case, not only did he not immediately side with them, but in evaluating the situation, sided with the mine owners. Threatened to seize the mines, which in a way was siding with the mine owners by going against the workers by going against the mine owners. I think I just said that backwards. All right. What else? To me, that's kind of it for labor. I'd talk about the square deal. He didn't necessarily want to give in to all workers' demands, nor side all with labor. He wanted to
a middle ground.
Right, a middle ground. I think the woman in the film who was a biographer of J.P. Morgan made a really good point, which was really this favored workers though, because business owners didn't need a square deal. They already had more than more than was fair for them. It was workers that needed a fair deal, and so in a way the square deal is it's siding on the side of workers. What about trusts? Right, he broke up trusts and used the Sherman Antitrust Act. He did break up a lot of trusts, and he used the federal government to do that. He didn't break up as much as the two men that followed him, but he broke up a lot, and I think that it's significant in that he's the first president to do this, to direct his attorney general and his Justice Department to break up trusts. Taft certainly broke up more, but he did it at a time where public sentiment had changed towards that because of, in my mind, because of the actions of Theodore Roosevelt. I would like it if you would talk about Northern Securities and breaking up J.P. Morgan's trust. It's significant in that if you're going to make a signal that you're about the new sheriffs in town, if you want to go after somebody, J.P. Morgan is the one to go after in the early 1900s. You might want to talk about how he did differentiate between good trust and bad trust, and he was willing to accept monopolies and trust if they didn't violate the public trust. But even that's a departure from what happened before. It's very different than what had existed under McKinley or Cleveland or all of those other overfed, bearded white people. What about conservation?
National parks.
Okay, and what I would do for this one is just look up some specific examples, but definitely he's the only one of the three that we looked at who is very interested in conservation. The other two aren't. For Taft, it's just not, well, for both Taft and Wilson, it's just not something that's on their radar. And for Theodore Roosevelt, it was a very personal thing, given how he felt about the outdoors and his own experiences in the outdoors. Okay, so what's not on here, Gerald was bringing up, if it asked about like consumer affairs, then you could talk about the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. That's not really in this question if it's just these 4 categories. The world affairs one is actually an imperialism question, but how did the role of the federal government change in regard to how we dealt with other countries during this time period? After today, if you don't know, then I'm sad. You would want to mention the direct intervention and involvement in the affairs of other nations by invoking the Monroe Doctrine, it's still on the board, claiming that if the U.S. must act as a police power if nations in the Western Hemisphere were inviting European intervention through defaulting on their debts. He also just had a more aggressive stance of foreign policy, whether it was his prosecution of the war against the Philippines, which he did inherit from McKinley, but he continued it. It finished under him. And also the Great White Fleet, the show of naval force, of sending the Navy around the world to impress everybody. Yeah.
What would you say would be like the biggest difference between him and McKinley?
In
What
a
was
specific
it?
area?
Yeah.
Like,
Because McKinley did like go after some stuff.
well, McKinley's not progressive in any way. Do you mean in foreign policy?
Yeah.
Oh, well, because I think for McKinley, this is what I was getting at in first period today, where I was trying to get you guys to identify like what the D's were. For McKinley, the dominant D was which one of those? Yeah, it was dollars, but it was also Darwinism, I think. McKinley's war message about the his message about the annexation of the Philippines is almost like a perfect outline of American foreign policy when he says, I took him for this reason and this reason. He does throw God in there, but the God, I guess deity's in there too, but I don't know if that's a big component of his foreign policy. When he says, we have to take the Philippines, I feel bad about it, but we have to. He does come right out and say, first of all, it'd be bad for business to not do it. That would be dumb. It's just like advantageous for us economically. That he just said that out loud is interesting. It means people must have understood that as a motivation and accepted it. Then he talks a lot about how we have to, because if we leave them, we'll leave them to another foreign nation, or perhaps gasp themselves, and therefore we need to be in there to protect them. And then when it came to him about the Philippines, he said we have to uplift and civilize and Christianize them. So for William McKinley, it really was about economic concerns, in as much as he was prodded on by people like Marcus Hanna and other business elements. And I think he also believed very much in the Darwinistic model of it, that he was a very religious man. I mean that as a criticism. Poor McKinley, he's dead, he can't defend himself. I don't like that word, like if someone's religious, like I know that may not be an important distinction, but to me, like, I'm a person of faith. My religious beliefs are very important to me, and they guide my daily life. But to me, someone being religious, it's like it's the things that you do rather than the actual commitment that you feel. Do you get what I'm saying? I don't want to pick on Catholics, especially on video. But you could have two different types of Catholics. You could have Catholics who very strongly believe in the spiritual truths that they're going to church and practicing. And you could have Catholics, and I'm picking on Catholics because there's a lot of form and ritual in the way that Catholics are supposed to carry out their religion, whether it's, you walk into the church, you need to do something. What is that? As soon as you walk into a church,
Holy water.
Catholics, there you go, there's some water there. I thought that was for washing my hands. I got in trouble. You're supposed to do what with it? Right. And then when the priest comes in, there's a certain order to worship. So I'm not saying that Catholics, like, they do those things, But in a religious